Good evening. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, 39 years old and a Nobel Peace Prize winner, and the leader of the nonviolent civil rights movement in the United States, was assassinated in Memphis tonight. A sniper's bullet cut down Dr. King as he stood on a hotel balcony in Memphis. Within an hour, Dr. King was dead. That happened at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. The nation was shocked. President Johnson expressed horror and then postponed his trip to Hawaii until tomorrow.
Here in Memphis, of course, a great deal of shock, a great deal of confusion, and a great deal of some violence. I can't say a great deal because I don't really know. I do know that police are very concerned, that the fire department is moving units around the streets, and that there is some rock throwing and some fires reported and some shooting. The full extent of at this time from this vantage point can't be assessed. The full curfew has been imposed on the streets of Memphis. Everyone except emergency vehicles are being cleared from the streets. The National Guard, which had been on duty here up until late last night, they have been recalled to duty and are being put on the streets of Memphis right away. Of course, a great deal of confusion and chaos resulting from the announcement here that Dr. King had died. The Lorraine Motel is a favorite place for Negro leaders to stay while in Memphis. It's a very nice new modern motel. He was on this second floor balcony, standing exactly where these two officers are, talking with some of his aides at the time of the shooting. The scene immediately became confused. Officers ran forward and attempted to secure the area. The shot apparently came from an apartment building directly across the street. The members of Dr. King's staff were there discussing a mass rally which was planned for tonight.
I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind.
Even while President Johnson talked to Chancellor Klaus about America's responsibility in a time of crisis and challenge, word came from Capitol Hill that Congress had passed and sent to the White House the Civil Rights Act of 1968. Included in the measure was a landmark open housing bill, which, when fully effective, would forbid discrimination in approximately 80% of all housing offered for rent or for sale in the United States.
I do not exaggerate when I say that the proudest moments of my presidency have been times such as this, when I have signed into law the promises of a century. I shall never forget that it is more than 100 years ago when Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. But it was a proclamation. It was not a fact. And in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we affirmed through law that men equal under God are also equal when they seek a job, when they go to get a meal in a restaurant, or when they seek lodging for the night in any state in the Union. And now the Negro families no longer suffer the humiliation of being turned away because of their race. In the Civil Rights Act of 1965, we affirmed through law for every citizen in this land the most basic right of democracy, the right of a citizen to vote in an election in his country. In the 5 states where the act had its greater impact, Negro voter registration has already more than doubled. Now with this bill, the voice of justice speaks again. It proclaims that fair housing for all human beings who live in this country is now a part of the American way of life. We all know that the roots of injustice run deep, but violence cannot redress a solitary wrong or remedy a single unfairness. And we just must put our shoulders together and put a stop to both. The time is here. Action must be now.
The Civil Rights Act of 1968 is a landmark law in the United States signed into law by United States President Lyndon B. Johnson during the King assassination riots. Titles II through VIII comprise the Indian Civil Rights Act, which applies to the Native American tribes of the United States and makes many, but not all of the guarantees of the Bill of Rights applicable within the tribes. Titles VIII through IX are commonly known as the Fair Housing Act, which was meant as a follow-up to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. While the Civil Rights Act of 1866 prohibited discrimination in housing, there were no federal enforcement provisions. The 1968 Act expanded on previous acts and prohibited discrimination concerning the sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, religion, national origin, and since 1974, sex.
On the 11th of April 1968, the Fair Housing Act, also known as Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, also known as Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act of 1968,
Titles II through VIII comprise the Indian Civil Rights Act, which applies to the Native American tribes of the United States, which applies to the Native American tribes of the United States, which applies to the Native American tribes of the United States.
Not Negroes pretending to be Indians in 2024. Thank you.
The Fair Housing Act, also known as Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, was signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson.
And Native American Indians are entitled to the same rights.
Few minorities have deeper or more justifiable grievances than Native Americans.
American Indians did not achieve citizenship en masse until 1924 with the Indian Citizenship Act. So from the very founding to 1924, you have a group of people who are viewed as essentially aliens or wards, essentially. That was the terminology that the United States used.
Just as the war was ending, there was talk of terminating the formal treaty and executive order relationships of the United States with the various tribes so that there would be no government-to-government relationship.
For much of the post-war period, the federal government seems determined to force Native Americans into the mainstream of American life.
And the idea was to set them up with positions, jobs, so that they could become mainstream Americans and have economic opportunities. And it worked to the advantage of some Indian people, at least initially. But what often happened was the initial job broke down and people ended up going unemployed and living in ghettos. And it separated people from their families, from their languages, from their cultural events, ceremonies that took place on the reservation. So it was difficult for lots of families.
Mimicking the civil rights movement, a group of Native Americans occupies Alcatraz Island to bring attention to their plight.
I remember George Horsecapture saying that the landing on Alcatraz Island was like the landing of the Marines at Iwo Jima, that there was something that dramatically had changed.
But then comes the incident known as Wounded Knee. It begins with the murder of a Lakota man in Custer County, South Dakota.
The decision was made that the person who had murdered this young man was going to get off very lightly, and it wasn't even going to be considered a murder. So the AIM people moved into Custer County and began threatening the county officials for what they had done. Things became very heated, and the AIM people decided to retreat to the Pine Ridge Reservation, to a small place that was symbolic of Native American history, a place called Wounded Knee. Then they proclaimed themselves an independent Oglala Sioux nation in defiance of the United States. And the clash came at Wounded Knee. It ended in tragedy with some FBI people dying, but also a number of Native people dying.
Thank you, Tom. Joining me here in New York is Peter Jennings, who's been on the road around the country, has seen some of the civil rights happenings, and has met Dr. King, and as I have. Peter, do you have any immediate thoughts about what this assassination, what the reactions may be around the country to it? I know this is highly speculative, but it's...
Yeah, I suppose the first concern, Bob, that everybody has, and it's obviously the one that Governor Buford Ellington has, and the people of Memphis have, and the people of Harlem have, and other major Negro areas in the cities around the country, is the outbreak of violence. I was sitting with a friend of mine tonight who's been very involved in thinking and believing in civil rights, and asked what his reaction was, and would there be violence? And he said no, he didn't think so, that King had created such a spirit, that this would not create a mass kind of violence like Malcolm X did. You know.
I think it bodes some waiting. Unfortunately, in New York's Harlem, it's raining tonight. Weather has a great deal to do with violence, as I'm sure that both you and I know, both in this country as indeed it does in some of the Latin countries where we have both served.
You know, there's a great, as Bob knows, there's a great radio station in New York here, WBAI are the call letters, I think, which is essentially a Harlem-oriented radio station. And on past occasions when things have got, you know, touchy in that particular area, WBAI has done a great deal to keep the community knit together and calm down. I was trying to get them on the radio tonight and find out if they were keeping things cool.
I remember when we were first made members of the Civil Disturbance Unit, we were taken down to this big CDU storeroom where all the weapons and the chemicals and the tear gas was stored on shelves. Were telling us, you know, there was enough tear gas there to control any kind of a demonstration or riot. Well, in 1968, we ran out of tear gas the very first night.
We could look down on 14th Street and everything was on fire. My mother came out and she started crying because she thought the world had ended. Fire trucks wouldn't stop because people were throwing bricks at it. It was a horrific scene.
Promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
Many of us know about the Civil Rights Movement, which is when Black Americans heroically fought for social justice and equality during the 1950s and 1960s. Unfortunately, the American Indian Civil Rights Movement is often overlooked. So what is it exactly? The American Indian Civil Rights Movement, or the American Indian Movement, AIM, as it's sometimes called, was established in Minneapolis, Minnesota in 1968 by a group of activists, namely Dennis Banks, Clyde Belcourt, Hetty Benton Benai, and George Mitchell. They originally aimed to improve conditions for Native Americans who had been urbanized and were living in ghettos after government programs forced them out of their reservations. However, AIM eventually encompassed everything that American Indians were demanding. More specifically, it fought for economic independence, the revitalization of their traditional culture, the protection of their legal rights, autonomy over tribal areas, and the restoration of lands that they had owned but were illegally seized from them. The founding of AIM came nearly a decade after the Indian Relocation Act of 1956 was passed, also referred to as Public Law 959 and the Adult Vocational Training Program. This legislation encouraged Native Americans to leave their reservations and traditional lands in order to assimilate into urban areas. Thousands of Native Americans did end up migrating to cities and other such urban areas. However, they experienced low-wage labor, substandard housing, discrimination, and violence. The initial activities of AIM were meant to help the Native Americans suffering in urban areas in Minneapolis. For example, they established the AIM Patrol to provide help and support to victims of police abuse. The organization also founded the Indian Health Board, which focused on providing Native-centric health care. As the years passed, AIM widened its focus to Native Americans outside of Minneapolis. For instance, it participated in the occupation of Alcatraz Island, which took place November 20th, 1969 to June 11th, 1971. This months-long protest saw 89 Native Americans and their supporters living on Alcatraz Island in the San Francisco Bay. They tagged buildings with slogans like "Red Power" and "Custer Had It Coming," in reference to George Armstrong Custer, the military commander known for his post-Civil War exploits against Native Americans. He's particularly famous for the 1876 Battle of the Little Bighorn, which has since come to be known as Custer's Last Stand. The Native Americans who participated in the occupation claimed that Alcatraz Island belonged to their people by right of discovery. However, the Nixon administration maintained that transferring the land to them was impossible. In the months that followed, the Native American population on Alcatraz Island swelled to more than 600. They even managed to form a governing council, a clinic, and a security force dubbed the Bureau of Caucasian Affairs, among other things. Unfortunately, their movement was quashed when they were forcibly removed by armed federal marshals. AIM participated in many other movements besides the occupation of Alcatraz Island. One of their most famous actions was the Longest Walk, which took place in July 1978 and saw a few hundred people trekking from Alcatraz Island in San Francisco, California. By the time they arrived in Washington, D.C., the marchers had swelled to more than 30,000. The Longest Walk hoped to raise awareness for the problems plaguing Native American communities across the United States, such as the lack of job opportunities and inadequate housing. Perhaps its biggest achievement, though, was the signing of the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, which lifted the ban on Native American spiritual ceremonies, which had been outlawed since 1884. Unfortunately, AIM's national leadership disbanded later that year due to infighting, jealousy, and the FBI's alleged efforts to divide them. Fortunately, several local chapters remained active afterward.
Don't you want somebody to love? Don't you need somebody to love? Wouldn't you love somebody to love? You better find somebody to love. Your eyes, I say, your eyes may look like his. Yeah, but in your head, baby, I'm afraid you don't know where it is. Don't you want somebody to love? Don't you need somebody to love? Wouldn't you love somebody to love? You better find somebody to love. Tears are running.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 had outlawed discrimination based on race, colour, religion, sex, or national origin. Nevertheless, significant obstacles remained for minorities who were attempting to secure equal housing rights. Despite their contributions to the American effort during the Second World War and the ongoing Vietnam War, racial minorities were still subject to overt discrimination when attempting to rent or purchase homes in residential areas. Organisations that included the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People and the GI Forum lobbied extensively for federal fair housing legislation, but despite the Fair Housing Act first being put to Congress in 1966, it was met with resistance that stalled its passage. However, over the next 2 years, the national atmosphere began to change, and in the aftermath of the race riots of 1967's Long Hot Summer, The Kerner Commission report strongly recommended equal housing legislation. On the 4th of April 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a vocal supporter of the bill, was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. His death prompted riots that spread across the country, amidst which President Lyndon B. Johnson urged Congress to pass the bill promptly as testament to King and his legacy.
Once King is killed, basically, as you would expect, the country kind of loses its mind, right? There are riots all across the country.
Tonight, the White House and the Capitol are surrounded by federal troops. They were brought in on the orders of President Johnson.
4,000 National Guard and federal troops are in this uneasy town tonight. Most are equipped with M16 rifles, helmets, and gas masks. Police report having made more than 600 arrests, with over half these still in custody. 3 deaths have been reported so far.
And I didn't really know that. I knew that there were a couple, and it makes perfect sense to me even now, or if you ever actually give it any sort of thought. But I mean, they were literally. They were the one thing. The biggest one was in Washington, D.C., and I have some footage here I'm going to share with you guys for a little bit, or in a little bit. But I'm going to read off to you a couple of the different areas that there actually were riots. I mean, there was riots, like I said, in D.C. There were riots in Chicago. There were riots in Kansas City. There were riots in Baltimore, Cincinnati, and all people died in all of these, which is why I'm mentioning this. I'm sure there were probably riots, maybe things that happened in other places, but people literally died in all these places. I mean, like I said at the beginning, I think over 40 people died during the riots that followed the death of Martin Luther King Jr.
Despite further attempts to delay the legislation, an hour of debate on the 10th of April led to the House approving the bill by a vote of 250 to 172. Johnson signed it into law the next day, just 2 days after King's funeral. The act made it illegal to discriminate regarding the sale, rental, or financing of housing based on race, religion, or national origin.
Be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right.
Congress, members of the Congress, members of the Cabinet, distinguished Americans, and guests. On an April afternoon in the year 1966, I asked a distinguished group of citizens that were interested in human rights to meet me in the Cabinet room in the White House. In their presence that afternoon, I signed a message to the Congress. That message called for the enactment, and I quote, of the first effective federal law against discrimination in the sale and the rental of housing in the United States of America. Few in the nation, and the record will show that very few in that room that afternoon, believed that fair housing would in our time become the unchallenged law of this land. And indeed, this bill has had a long and stormy trip. We did not get it in 1966. We pled for it again in 1967. But the Congress took no action that year. We asked for it again this year. And now, at long last, this afternoon, its day has come. I do not exaggerate when I say that the proudest moments of my presidency have been times such as this, when I have signed into law the promises of a century. I shall never forget that it is more than 100 years ago when Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. But it was a proclamation. It was not a fact. And in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we affirmed through law that men equal under God are also equal when they seek a job, when they go to get a meal in a restaurant, or when they seek lodging for the night in any state in the Union. And now the Negro families no longer suffer the humiliation of being turned away because of their race. In the Civil Rights Act of 1965, we affirmed through law for every citizen in this land the most basic right of democracy, the right of a citizen to vote in an election in his country. In the 5 states where the act had its greater impact, Negro voter registration has already more than doubled. Now with this bill, the voice of justice speaks again. It proclaims that fair housing for all human beings who live in this country is now a part of the American way of life. We all know that the roots of injustice run deep. But violence cannot redress a solitary wrong or remedy a single unfairness. Of course, all America is outraged at the assassination of an outstanding Negro leader who was at that meeting that afternoon in the White House in 1966. And America is also outraged at the looting and the burning that defiles our democracy. And we just must put our shoulders together and put a stop to both. The time is here. Action must be now. So I would appeal to my fellow Americans by saying the only real road to progress for free people is through the process of law. And that is the road that America will travel. So I urge the Congress to enact the measures for social justice that I have recommended in some 20 messages. These messages went to the Congress in January and February of this year. They broke a precedent by being completed and delivered and read and printed. These measures provide more than $78 billion that I have urged the Congress to enact for major domestic programs for all America in the fiscal 1969 budget. This afternoon, as we gather here in this historic room in the White House, I think we can all take some heart that democracy's work is being done. In the Civil Rights Act of 1968, America does move forward. And the bell of freedom rings out a little louder. We have come some of the way, not near all of it. There is much yet to do. And if the Congress sees fit to act upon these 20 messages in some 15 appropriation bills, I assure you that what remains to be done will be recommended in ample time for you to do it after you've completed what's already before you. Thank you very much.
In honor of Martin Luther King Day, we celebrate the American Indian Civil Rights Act. As we honor the path to the equal civil rights and liberties for all Americans, we remember the unique struggles faced by our American Indian people. American Indian tribes have been exercising political sovereignty for thousands of years, long before the creation of the United States. Tribes have practiced this sovereignty through traditional beliefs, spirituality and ceremonies, native language, leadership and organization, and social and economic structures. When the United States was being developed, the founders recognized the unique political status of Indian tribes and built this into the U.S. Constitution. American Indian tribes were recognized as sovereigns, as established through many treaties, acts, and laws. Did you know members of American Indian tribes were recognized as citizens of the United States in 1924? During the 1960s and 70s, American Indian activism fought to overcome the following: racial and social injustice, recognition of tribal sovereignty, treaty rights, and self-determination. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 clarified that American Indians cannot be prohibited or discriminated in voting in federal and state elections on the basis of race, color, and native languages. President Lyndon Johnson signed the American Indian Civil Rights Act in 1968, also known as the Indian Bill of Rights. The American Indian Civil Rights Act recognized and preserved tribal rights and human rights of individual Indians. It also recognized tribal sovereignty and the dual nature of citizenship that our tribal citizens enjoy today. The Indian Civil Rights Act also created a framework to protect individual Indians from injustice or corrupt tribal governments by limiting tribal government power. As we recognize the civil rights guaranteed to all Americans, it's important to recognize how American Indian tribes practice tribal sovereignty.
Psst, I see pseudo people.
Aye, monster on the beat, ho.